children. She has a master's degree in education policy from Harvard University and a bachelor's degree in economics from Bowdoin College. Kerry McDonald is a senior education fellow at the Foundation for Economic Freedom and host of the weekly Liberated podcast. She is also the author of Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. Her research interests include homeschooling and schooling alternatives, self-directed learning, education entrepreneurship, parent empowerment, school choice, and family and child policy. So without further ado, please join me in warmly welcoming Kerry McDonald.
Oh, thank you, Kanan. It's so great to be here. I am thrilled that the Liberation of Education Conference is happening. I agree with Michael in his introductory remarks tonight that this is a golden age for education entrepreneurship. And I am just so thrilled to share with you some of my insights over the past couple of years of education disruption and some of the opportunities that that's led to. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and share the presentation that I have for this evening. So it has been obviously a couple of years of massive education disruption. I don't think American education will ever be the same, but I think it's important to note, ways in which disruption can create opportunity. And there is some precedent here. If we think back to 2005, in the wake of Hurricane Katrina that devastated the city of New Orleans and displaced a lot of families and certainly created a lot of changes in the education system. In the wake of that catastrophe, it led to the city of New Orleans becoming a nearly all charter school district. So along with kind of the physical destruction in the city, it also destroyed some of the bureaucratic and institutional structures that were in place, paving the way for charter schools. And of course, charter schools are taxpayer funded, tuition free for families, but typically privately run. And that provides a lot more autonomy, a lot more accountability. They're typically not connected as closely to teachers' unions. Administrators have much more flexibility in terms of hiring and firing decisions. And if they're not meeting expectations or they're not attracting families, they shut down. So it has that kind of free market feel to it. And again, in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans went that route with a lot of success. They have fewer students now than they did kind of pre-Katrina, but they're sending double the number to college. And they've also experienced other academic gains as well. Now, of course, I feel like the disruption that's occurred over the past couple of years during the COVID response in some ways is even a bigger magnitude than what happened in Hurricane Katrina, because of course it was nationwide, it was global. And again, I don't think American education will ever be the same. So if we go back and think about, kind of what's occurred over the past couple of years, I think of it in terms of the 3 E's of education transformation. There's vast parental empowerment beginning in the spring of 2020 with school closures. That led to exit, parents exercising their right of exit to leave an assigned district school and begin exploring other learning options, like many of you are doing tonight, kind of continuing that process. And then it led to this kind of cultivation and expansion of entrepreneurship. And I'm looking forward to talking with you about each of these 3 E's with special attention to entrepreneurship. So if we go back for a bit to the spring of 2020 and we think about what was happening when schools shut down, certainly disruptive and difficult for families all across the country and around the world. But what it did do was provide a real close-up look for a lot of families of what was happening in their children's schools. And much of what they saw, they didn't like. They might have seen for the first time, what their kids were learning and doing, and had some reservations about that. I talked to one mother back in the spring of 2020 who, through district Zoom school, discovered that her teacher was reading a book to the class that her daughter had read to herself 2 years prior. And that made her think, wow, I didn't realize the lack of academic rigor that was occurring in my child's school. and therefore decided to pull her child out for homeschooling and ultimately enrolled her in a private school earlier this year. So that was some of the things that were happening. I think other families saw the spring of 2020 disruption as an opportunity to try something different. They may have been dissatisfied with their child's school at that time, but kind of lacked the catalyst to make a change, whether that was giving homeschooling a try. Maybe they were always intrigued by the idea of homeschooling, but lacked that initiative to give it a go. Maybe they were always interested in a kind of high quality private virtual learning platform, but didn't know where to go for that, or another private school option. And the school closures really enabled that to happen. One of the other things that, of course, began to occur over the summer of 2020 was the rise of the pandemic pod movement. And this was sort of an example of spontaneous parent initiative where parents would just organically connect with each other on social media networks and various local community networks to provide their children with some social interaction after having been separated for several months in the spring, and realizing that the fall looked a little unsettled, that there would be remote learning, or at best, if schools were open, it wasn't going to be a return to normal. And so they started to take matters into their own hands and form these pandemic pods where they would either pool their resources to hire an educator or a college student to facilitate a curriculum, or they would take turns as parents in different homes to, again, kind of lead a curriculum or supervise the children. And this was sort of a modern take on the time-honored homeschool co-op model that, of course, has been around since the rise of the modern homeschool movement. These pandemic pods also were in many ways similar to the microschool movement that was gaining traction prior to the spring of 2020 in these kind of one-room schoolhouse feels. There were multi-age learning communities, typically with an outside educator kind of facilitating a curriculum. So the pandemic pods kind of slid into what was already kind of an existing model and really expanded that to more and more parents who may have never known that existed. And then as 2020 moved along and we kind of headed into the fall of 2020, I think a lot of families looked at the fact that their schools would be closed. And increasingly, there was research suggesting that the number one factor of whether a school district reopened for full-time in-person learning was how powerful the teachers union was in that particular area. And I think a lot of parents really underestimated the power and influence of teachers unions and got a close-up look at that. And that really empowered them and made them take matters into their own hands. Corey DeAngelis, I think many of you know him. He's one of the leading school choice advocates in the country. He has published numerous peer-reviewed research articles documenting this correlation between teacher union influence and school reopening decisions. And he's also noted that because of kind of the teacher union influence in school closures and related COVID policies, this has led to much greater support for school choice policies over the past couple of years. 2021 was considered the year of school choice, with more than 24 states introducing or expanding school choice legislation. So a great time to have, education funding follow students instead of going to school systems that are increasingly unresponsive to parent needs and demands, and that in some cases simply didn't open at all. Corey was recently on my Liberated podcast a couple of weeks ago, and he said in that podcast that he's optimistic because parents have been empowered and emboldened over the past couple of years. They've woken up to the problems of the government-run school system, and they're pushing for real solutions. And that's really what started to happen throughout 2020 and 2021, where parents began to exercise their right of exit. So public school enrollment declined in 2020. Estimates are between 1.5 and 2 million students nationwide exited the public school system or didn't enroll their child in a pre-K or early kindergarten program. They kind of delayed school entry. And this really came to light with the Census Bureau's data that was released in the spring of 2021, but it looked at data from the spring of 2020 to the fall of 2020. And found that homeschooling numbers had doubled during that period of time, spring of 2020 to fall of 2020, and really was a tripling or more than tripling of homeschooling numbers from pre-pandemic levels. The most recent federal data on homeschooling is from 2016, the U.S. Department of Education suggesting that about a little under 3.5% of U.S. K-12 school-age population was homeschooled. According to the Census Bureau data of spring of 2021, they found that more than 11% of children were being homeschooled in the U.S. And interestingly enough, the largest demographic group that was seeing the most gains, kind of driving the surge, were Black homeschoolers, who experienced a 5-fold increase in homeschooling rates from the spring of 2020 to the fall of 2020, and at that time became overrepresented in the homeschool population compared to the public school population. So there's about over 16% of the homeschool population were Black homeschoolers, compared to just about 15% of the overall K-12 public school population as Black students. And this exit really has continued over this year. So many people, I think, suspected, rightfully so, that when schools reopened for in-person learning in the fall of 2021, families would return to school. But in fact, that simply didn't happen. There was data that came out last fall that showed that particularly in major urban districts that were certainly open for in-person full-time learning, but still had strict COVID policies in place and mask wearing in place, there were continuing to be dropping enrollment levels. I think of Los Angeles, for example. Los Angeles public schools lost 4.8% of their student population in the 2020-2021 academic year. They lost an additional 6% in the 2021-2022 academic year. Similarly, in Chicago, that public school district lost about 14,500 students in the 2020-2021 academic year. They lost an additional 10,000 students this academic year. And the Associated Press just a couple of weeks ago confirmed this. They said, homeschooling rates remain really high this academic year. They dipped slightly from last year's peak, but they're still quite elevated. And in fact, there were other data coming out of Chicago, as I mentioned before, that suggested that even though the homeschool population rate or the homeschool rate dipped a bit from last year's record high, still well above pre-pandemic levels, most of those families were continuing to choose private school or Catholic schools instead of going back to the district school. So even though homeschooling numbers may have dipped slightly, those students aren't necessarily going back to district schools. So where are these learners going, and what is happening kind of behind the scenes to support this exit from an assigned district school? And this is where I think, some of the most exciting work is happening, and it's really in entrepreneurship. So I launched my Liberated podcast back in February, and my first guest was a mom and a teacher. She's a mother of 4 in New Jersey named Jill Perez. And she decided to launch a learning center that evolved out of the pandemic pod that she created. So she had been a teacher for 20 years. She had more recently transitioned into teacher education at the university level. So she was supervising student teachers. And when the school closures occurred in the spring of 2020 and then ongoing COVID policies in the fall of 2020, she pulled her kids out and created a pandemic pod with other families who, wanted to provide that kind of consistent learning experience and social connection. And that was so popular that she decided to expand it. She realized that the fall of 2021 was looking increasingly uncertain, that she didn't like some of the COVID policies that were in place in her children's schools, and realized that there were a lot of other families in her area that had similar concerns and wanted to create something that was more established than a pandemic pod. And so she evolved her pandemic pod into a full-fledged microschool that opened in the fall of 2021 that now has over 50 students, kind of multi-age, in this learning space. She leased a building in the fall, but it's been so popular that now she has expanded to purchase her own building and continues to grow. And it runs on a private membership association model, so she has maximum autonomy. Most of the families are recognized homeschoolers. They can come as a drop-off program, part-time or full-time as a full-time schooling alternative. And an interesting thing she told me in the podcast was that she was able to recruit a lot of teachers from New York who didn't want to comply with various COVID policies in those schools. And so she recruited them into her learning center. She said, even though she can't pay them as much as they were making in the public schools, they love the freedom and flexibility. And she said that she loves the fact that these are her thinking teachers. These are the teachers who are questioning everything, who are independent thinkers, original creative thinkers, and they're just thriving in her learning center. So that's another way in which entrepreneurship can benefit teachers as well as families and learners. A lot of other educators are kind of going through the same process of launching their own micro schools. They may be burnt out with all of the things going on in these school districts. And so they're going off to create a micro school or some kind of co-op, or in the case of Jill's Learning Center in New Jersey, joining an established micro school there. We've also seen demand grow in various Acton academies. I know many of you are going to stay tuned to listen to Matt Boudreau talk about his Acton Academy Placer outside of Sacramento. I featured him and a couple of other Acton academies in a Forbes article of mine in December. And as Matt will tell you, he says he can't build schools fast enough. He has over 300 families. There is tremendous excitement for what he's doing. Acton Academy had been a growing micro school network prior to COVID-19 and the school shutdowns, and it's just continued to expand options for more families. And again, a lot of these micro schools or hybrid schools, which are kind of part-time homeschool programs where you go to a building a couple of days a week and then you maybe spend the rest of the time at home or elsewhere in the community. These are all, a fraction of the cost of standard private schools, often a quarter or a third of the cost of a typical private school in a given area. The national average tuition annually for hybrid schools, for example, hybrid homeschools, is about $5,000 a year. And so it's really, accessible to more families because of kind of the autonomy and flexibility that these schools have. Some of them are set up as standard private schools, but a lot of them are set up as hybrid homeschools or PMAs, these private membership associations, or homeschool resource centers that enable them to really have, again, maximum freedom and autonomy. I interviewed Professor Eric Warren, who is a professor at Kennesaw State University in Georgia. He's also an expert on hybrid schools and hybrid homeschools. In fact, I'm presenting at the Hybrid Schools Conference at Kennesaw State later this week. And the hybrid school movement encapsulates a lot of this energy around micro schools and different kind of part-time to full-time options that are available for families that are often low cost and much more accessible. And Professor Warren says, these are great examples of small groups of civil society coming together and solving a problem. They're not waiting for some big government entity to solve it. They're not complaining about not having money. They're just going out and doing it. I think that's a good sign for the country and for society. And I would agree, these are inspiring education entrepreneurs who see a problem and want to come up with a solution, often for their family, that then helps others in their communities as well. In my podcast today that just dropped today, I featured Ada Sali, who runs a homeschool resource center in Massachusetts, where I'm located. She is similar to Jill Perez in that she, during the beginning of COVID and throughout the COVID process, wanted her children to have a lot of social interaction. She began building community within the homeschool population of kind of like-minded families who also wanted that social interaction with other children. She began holding events and offering lessons and so on. And that, like Jill, evolved into a full-fledged micro school or homeschool resource center that she launched this past fall. And it's thriving. She's able to really serve a lot of families. And in fact, she said that, she has families that drive up to an hour to get to her program, which is also a drop-off program for homeschoolers who can come either 2, 3, or 5 days a week. It can be a full-time schooling alternative, even though they're registered homeschoolers. And she says, the issue really is lack of services. The demand is there. It's the need for more and more education entrepreneurs to step up and build these models. So I'd recommend you check out my interview with Ada that dropped today. You can find the podcast wherever you get your podcasts or visit liberatedpodcast.com. So those are kind of my 3 E's in thinking about education transformation over the past couple of years: parent empowerment, parent exit, and entrepreneurship. But I do think a 4th E is exciting. Like, again, Michael said, this is the golden age for education entrepreneurship. I think it's a golden age for education more broadly. It's a great time to be a parent, an educator, a learner, and an entrepreneur. So if we think about kind of the takeaways before I open it up to some questions here, seek, build, and connect, right? So first is recognize that there are so many learning options available to you. You're here in this conference because you acknowledge that that is true and you're curious about what's available for you. So seek out all of the different options, many of which are incredibly accessible, and experiment, see what works, and what works for one of your children may not work for another child, and so on. So it's a great way to explore what's available. The second thing is, if you don't see anything that kind of resonates with you, build your own. As I mentioned, Ada says that there is no shortage of demand. There's a shortage of supply. So think about hanging up your own shingle and being an education entrepreneur and building what you can't yet find. And finally, connect. I would love to connect with you. I try to build community with education entrepreneurs across the country. I hold small focus groups and entrepreneur chats with entrepreneurs kind of building learning centers and homeschool programs and micro schools across the country. So please reach out to me if you'd like to be a part of that as well. Again, you can find me in various places. If you go to liberatedpodcast.com, you can connect with me there. You can send me an email from there. You can visit me at the Foundation for Economic Education, where most of my writing is done, at fee.org/Kerry, and find me on social media, including Twitter at kerry.edu. So that is about it in terms of the prepared presentation, but I would love to kind of open it up for questions or comments from all of you. So let's see. I think we have, what is the name of Ada's school and where is it? So I'm going to put her website here, life-rediscovered.com. It's in central Massachusetts. So definitely check that out. Let's see. Oh, lots of great questions. So that was right. Heather said, what was the name of Ada's school? So I just gave that. Let's see, what else?
Kerry, there was one question. How does homeschooling really work?
Well, I think the answer is it works in all kinds of different ways. And what I'm really excited about are the ways in which it becomes a collaborative process. You know, I think this sort of stereotype of homeschooling lingers, of this idea that you have a parent, typically a mom, sitting around a kitchen table with a bunch of textbooks, leading a curriculum all day. You know, I'm not sure that was ever really true, but it's certainly not true, or not primarily true, in the 21st century, and definitely not true in the last several years, as there's just so many more resources available to families who register as homeschoolers. I mean, homeschooling really provides that kind of legal flexibility, that pedagogical flexibility to find a program that works for you. And so more and more you see families who register as homeschoolers but may enroll their children in a 5-day-a-week micro school or some kind of part-time hybrid homeschool program. And that's where the bulk of the kind of curriculum and instruction is coming from.
There was one, it wasn't necessarily a question, but just talking about the difference with homeschooling and maybe absenteeism, and just kind of, if you can talk on that at all. So like maybe parents that have just, it was Steve and Peggy were kind of talking about it. Peggy had said, thinking many lost jobs are changed to working from home and are keeping their kids home for convenience.
Well, I don't know about convenience. I think really the shift toward hybrid work or remote work is also providing such an incredible foundation for education freedom for a lot of families. Just like education won't ever be the same, I don't think work will ever be the same. And now that a lot of parents have the ability to work part-time from home and then in the office, this kind of expectation of being in an office building 5 days a week, 9 to 5, has sort of gone out the window for a lot of adults. And so they're kind of looking around and saying, well, why are we then expecting our children to continue to go to school 5 days a week at the same building and be in that one place for that full-time experience? So I think as more and more adults have freedom and flexibility in their work schedules, they want to grant that same freedom and flexibility to their children. Anything else, Kanan? I'm trying to scroll down here.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't unmute myself. Another question, how big a divide do you see between religious and secular homeschoolers?
Yeah, it's interesting that if you look at the history of the rise of the modern homeschooling movement that began in the late 1960s and early 1970s, it actually began on the political left with kind of radical hippies who were looking for education freedom and lifestyle freedom, living on communes in some cases. So that's where it began. And then it quickly spread to the political right, where it gained a lot of numbers throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Homeschooling became legally recognized in all 50 states by the mid-1990s. The U.S. Department of Education first began tracking homeschoolers in the late 1990s, counting about 850,000 at that time. And now, of course, we have over 5 million homeschoolers, according to the U.S. Census Bureau data from 2020. And it looks like that number is staying high, again, because we have so much more opportunities for homeschoolers. So I think they realize that there are these incredible resources around them.
And then another from Jessica. Have you heard from teachers wanting to leave the public schools, wanting to continue to teach in the micro school or hybrid program instruction, thinking there might be a demand for teachers also looking for alternative teaching opportunities? Any ideas on how to best connect?
Absolutely. The Rand Corporation did a survey at the end of last year, finding that the majority of teachers felt burnt out. Many of them wanted to leave by the end of the school year. One of the major teacher unions just ran a survey earlier this year suggesting that more than half of their members expected to leave the field sooner than later, or sooner than expected. So there's a lot of frustration for teachers, just as there is for parents and learners. I mean, don't forget, teachers are caught up in kind of the same bureaucratic standardized system that families are caught up in. They aren't able to use their full creativity and their gifts and why they went into teaching to kind of impact children and help them reach their full potential. So teachers are as trapped in the system as parents and learners are in many cases. But I think, again, that this trend toward education entrepreneurship is opening up a lot of doors for them. They're able to either seek out a micro school or hybrid school or some kind of other learning model, one-on-one tutoring and so on, or go and launch their own. I mean, many of these micro schools that have emerged have come from disenchanted teachers who thought they could do things better and found out that there is actually tremendous demand for those services.
And then there was one more question. Do you think the U.S. Department of Education will try to regulate micro schools?
I don't think it'll come from the federal level. The federal level, thankfully, has, for now, a small role in education policy. Let's try to keep it that way. I think most of the concern comes at the state level, and that's where we do have to push back. We have to make sure that there is kind of a push towards deregulation, that a lot of these programs that operate as homeschool resource centers or private membership associations so far have been able to run without kind of regulatory hurdles. There was an effort in the wake of 2020 in some states to incorporate or recognize pandemic pods as a legitimate education option. And in some cases, making sure that they don't become regulated. And so I think that's the key. We should be removing barriers for education entrepreneurs. We should make it easier for visionary parents, educators, and innovators to launch new learning models. And that should be our focus.
That's awesome. Kerry, thank you so much. Y'all feel free to continue in here discussing. I see that there's still some more questions in the chat, Kerry, but I'm going to head on to the next breakout. And again, thank you so much, Kerry. This was amazing. If you guys could fill out, there's a poll up at the top. If y'all could fill that out, let us know the things that you loved about this session. That would be great. Thank you.
Thanks, Kanan.